Kim Myong-gil said it only once. I think I'm losing my mind over a woman who doesn't even want my money. The silence that swallowed those words was not ordinary silence. It was the kind that fills a room like smoke. Slow, heavy, impossible to breathe around. His second-in-command, Park Sun-jae, set down his glass with the careful precision of a man who had just heard something that fundamentally did not compute. He stared. He said nothing. For 7 full seconds, he simply stared. Because Kim Myong-gil did not say things like that. Kim Myong-gil had never said anything like that. They were alone in the private floor of KMG Tower, 42 stories above Seoul's financial district, in a room with no cameras, no staff, no witnesses. Below them, the Han River cut through the city like a black ribbon threaded with light. Up here, the air tasted like aged whiskey and the particular kind of cold that comes with too much power and not enough sleep. Myong-gil's empire spanned 3 continents. His name was not spoken in certain boardrooms because it carried the same weight as a sealed verdict. He had built it from nothing, from the kind of nothing that leaves marks on a man, with nerve, with silence, and with a ruthlessness that had never once been personal. Until now. Sun-jae chose his next words with surgical care. "Say that again," he said, slowly. Myong-gil didn't repeat himself. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling glass, one hand loose in the pocket of his navy suit jacket, his jaw set in that particular way that meant the matter was already far past dismissal. He was dressed the way he always dressed, precisely, expensively, without a single detail out of place, and yet something about him looked undone. Something around his eyes. Sun-jae leaned forward slowly. "Who is she?" The question landed and sat there, unanswered, for a long beat. Myong-gil's reflection stared back at him from the glass, sharp-featured, controlled, the face of a man who had long ago learned that showing too much was the same as handing someone a weapon. Then, he said her name. Tabia Nwosu. A pause. Then, she slid my black card back across a mahogany table and told me her husband was already bleeding out, that she'd cut the artery herself. 3 weeks ago. Sun-jae blinked. She returned the card. Without looking at it. Another silence. A different kind this time. The kind that comes right before a man revises everything he thought he understood about another man. Myong-gil finally turned from the window. His expression was unreadable in the precise way that meant it was costing him something to keep it that way. He crossed to the leather chair across from Sun-jae and sat, not with the casual authority he always carried, but with the measured stillness of a man who has realized he is in territory without a map. "She's dismantling her husband's empire," he said, from the inside, methodically. "She has been playing the obedient wife for 2 years while quietly rerouting his offshore accounts, turning his board against him, and building a legal case so airtight that when it closes, it will close, like a coffin." He looked at his hands for a moment. "I offered her every resource I have." She laughed. "She told me death was too generous for him, that she didn't want him erased. She wanted him alive, watching everything he built become hers." Sun-jae was quiet for a long moment. "And this is the part," he said finally, voice careful as a man navigating unmarked glass, "where you tell me you walked away from a woman who clearly does not need or want your involvement." Myong-gil looked at him. The look said everything. Sun-jae exhaled. Slowly, thoroughly, like a man releasing the last of a world that still made sense to him. "Hyung," he said quietly. "She doesn't want your money. She doesn't want your protection, and from the sound of it, she doesn't want your interference. So what exactly is it," he asked with genuine bewildered curiosity, "that you plan to do?" Myong-gil picked up his glass, looked at the city below, a ghost of something, not quite a smile, but its shadow, crossed his mouth. "Watch," he said simply. "For now, I'm going to watch a woman burn down a kingdom she built on her knees, and make sure no one touches her while she does it." He set the glass down. "And then," he said, quieter now, almost to himself, I'm going to figure out how to make a woman who wants nothing from anyone want something from me." Sanjay stared at him for a long time. He thought about several responses. He chose none of them. He just picked up his glass and drank. Because when Kim Myong-gil decided he wanted something, the only people who said it was impossible were the people who hadn't watched him get it yet. 18 months earlier, Tabia Nwosu had learned how to disappear inside a smile. Not the kind of disappearing that breaks a person, the kind that builds one. She understood the mechanics of it with the clarity of someone who had studied the architecture of a trap from the inside and located, with patience, every single load-bearing wall. Julian needed an audience more than he needed a wife. As long as she was present, attentive, and decorative, he never looked closely enough to notice what her hands were doing. She had built her invisibility the way a craftsman builds a precision instrument, without rushing, without sentiment, with the specific purpose already decided before the first cut. The morning it became irreversible, she was at the far end of their dining table in the Lagos penthouse. Cream silk robe, hair loose, a cup of tea at her elbow that she had not touched. Outside, the Atlantic was doing what it always did, existing, indifferently, at a scale that made human problems feel briefly absurd. Julian stood at the kitchen island talking at her about a board meeting. He talked the way he always talked, as though she were furniture that had recently been upgraded to the kind that could nod. She nodded. She smiled at the correct intervals. She said, "That sounds like exactly what you needed to hear from them, baby," in the warm, admiring register she had refined over 22 months of daily practice. And with her right hand, below the table's edge, hidden behind the overhang of the linen cloth, she plugged a slim encrypted drive into the laptop balanced on her knees. She told herself this was the last piece she needed. She had been telling herself that for 3 months. Julian's offshore accounts had not been difficult to find. That was the first thing that had genuinely surprised her. How catastrophically careless a man became when he decided the woman across from him at breakfast was simply not equipped to look. The shell companies nested inside each other like lacquered boxes, each one slightly smaller than the last. The Cayman Islands account routing, through a Luxembourg subsidiary, the quarterly disbursements that appeared nowhere in any official filing. She had found the first thread 8 months into the marriage when she'd opened what she believed was a household expenses folder on his shared drive. What she found instead was a spreadsheet that made her sit completely still in his home office at 2 in the morning for a full 60 seconds. She had closed the folder, gone back to bed, lain in the dark beside the man who had built this architecture while she slept next to him, and she had not cried. She had not reached for her phone. She had thought with a precision that surprised even her. Not yet. And then, in the morning, she had begun. The question was never whether she could destroy him. The question was whether she could do it so completely, so legally, so publicly, that he would spend the rest of his life understanding exactly how it happened and knowing with absolute certainty that there was nothing he could have done to stop it. Kim Myong-gil had been in Lagos for 48 hours on a matter that had nothing to do with Tabia Nwosu or her husband. He was crossing the marble lobby of the Echo Atlantic's most exclusive business hotel, moving toward an elevator, when he saw her. Not because she was beautiful, though she was, in the way of a woman who had long since stopped deploying beauty as a tool of persuasion. Because of what she was doing. She was seated in a low chair near the lobby's eastern wall. White blazer over deep green silk. One leg crossed over the other with the ease of a woman who had made peace with occupying space. A champagne flute on the side table, barely touched. On her lap, a document dense with figures, which she was reading with the absolute stillness of a surgeon reviewing imaging before making the first incision. Across the lobby, her husband stood at the concierge desk, animated, laughing. One hand resting on the shoulder of a woman who was not his wife, and looking at her with an attention that Myong-gil catalogued in under 2 seconds. He looked at the husband for exactly those 2 seconds. Then he looked at Tabia. She had seen it. He was certain. The fractional pause in the movement of her eyes across the page. The almost imperceptible stillness, half a breath long, that preceded her returning her gaze to the document, turning a page with 2 fingers, and making a small annotation in the margin with the pen she held loosely in her left hand. She had seen it. She had registered it. And she had decided in real time to file it. Not to react. Not to perform the reaction. To file it. The elevator arrived. The doors opened. Myung-gil did not get on it. He stood in the lobby of that hotel and watched Tabian Wosu for 4 more minutes with the focused, quiet attention he reserved for things he did not yet understand but recognized, instinctively, as important. Then he took out his phone. "The woman in the white blazer at the east wall," he said when Sunjay picked up. "Find out who she is." By midnight he had a file. By the following morning he had read it twice. By the end of the week he had 3 men assigned to her movements, and was telling himself things he would, within a month, completely stop believing. Here is what Myung-gil's men documented in the weeks that followed, in the dry, precise language of surveillance reports that somehow failed to capture what they were actually recording. Subject maintains dual behavioral profiles: public profile, compliant, socially fluid, non-confrontational. Private profile, methodical, legally precise, operating on a timeline that appears to predate current observation period by at least 12 months. Subject is aware of surveillance. Subject has not altered behavior in response. That last line was the one that stayed with him. He intercepted her on a Tuesday. She was leaving a private meeting with her attorney, a woman whose firm occupied the 14th floor of a building in Victoria Island, and she had taken the stairs rather than the elevator, a habit she kept whenever she was carrying documents. She pushed through the stairwell door into the lobby and found Myung-gil standing there, hands in his pockets, wearing charcoal and patience. She stopped, looked at him, then looked at the 2 men positioned near the building entrance with the expressionless recognition of a woman who had identified them 3 days ago and had simply been waiting for the moment they would be relevant. "Mr. Kim," she said, pleasantly neutral, the voice of someone who finds something mildly interesting. "This feels elaborate for an introduction. I find direct approaches save time." "They do," she agreed. "What do you want?" He had prepared for multiple versions of this conversation. What he had not prepared for was the specific quality of her attention. The way she looked at him as though she were reviewing a document she had already mostly finished and was now simply confirming the last few figures. "I want to offer you a solution," he said, "to the Julian Osei situation." Something moved briefly behind her eyes, then was gone. "I wasn't aware I had a situation." "You have a husband currently embezzling from his own company through subsidiary accounts he believes are invisible," Myung-gil said, "and a mistress he plans to install as COO before quarter's end." He held her gaze. "I can make him disappear. Quietly. Permanently, if that's your preference, or simply financially. Collapse his funding, ruin his reputation, ensure he never sits on another board. I have the resources. It would take 11 days. Tabia was quiet for a moment. Then she laughed. Not the polished social variety she deployed at galas. Something real. Brief and unguarded. The laugh of a woman who has just heard something she finds genuinely, unexpectedly funny. "Mr. Kim," she said when it passed, with respect. "Death is the most generous thing you could offer Julian Osei. The man deserves to be alive. Awake. Watching." Her eyes were steady on his, occupying the narrow territory between warmth and warning. "I don't want him gone. I want him standing in the wreckage of everything he spent 20 years building, understanding exactly how it happened, knowing he cannot prove a single thing." She adjusted her bag strap. "I've been inside his financials for 14 months. I have documentation that would make a federal prosecutor weep. I have 3 board members who trust me over him and don't yet know how useful that trust is about to become." A tilt of her head. "I don't need you to burn down my house. I already cut the gas line. She stepped around him and walked toward the door. Tell your men they can stand down, she said, without turning. Or don't. But if they're going to follow me, they should know I walk fast. She walked out of the building and into the afternoon heat of Victoria Island. Myung-gil stood in the lobby for a long moment after the door closed. Sunjae, later that evening, would ask him what she had said. Myung-gil would pour himself a drink before answering. That, in itself, told Sunjae everything. She had been right about one thing. Julian's mistress was not stupid. She was, however, slightly less intelligent than she believed herself to be. Which, in Tabia's experience, was always the most dangerous configuration of smart. The kind that mistakes thoroughness for genius, and therefore doesn't look for the ceiling. Nadia had spent 6 weeks building what she clearly believed was an elegant trap. A series of transactions routed through a company account carrying Tabia's secondary signature, structured to appear, on cursory examination, as corporate theft. She had been meticulous. She had been patient. Tabia had known about it for 4 weeks before Nadia executed it. In that time, she had done 3 things. She retained a forensic accountant and instructed him to document, in real time, the transaction architecture Nadia was constructing, without intervening, without alerting anyone, simply recording. Then she added a layer of her own, a digital audit trail logging every access point Nadia used, time-stamped, IP addressed, preserved on a server that existed entirely outside Julian's awareness, and she had called the federal investigator she had been cultivating for 8 months and told him, in measured, general terms, that she anticipated an attempt to falsify her involvement in certain financial irregularities within the coming weeks. She told him she would be in touch. When the trap closed, when Julian called her into his office with the barely restrained satisfaction of a man who believes he has finally caught the woman he spent 2 years underestimating, Tabia sat across from him and listened to every word. She let him finish. She let him slide the printed transaction records across the desk. She let him say, with a satisfaction he couldn't fully contain, that he was weighing his options. Then she opened her own folder. 47 pages. Those are Nadia's access logs, she said pleasantly, alongside the Shell Company documentation, the original wire instructions in her handwriting, and a letter from my attorney time-stamped 3 weeks ago advising the relevant authorities of the anticipated attempt. She folded her hands on the desk. The forensic accountant's report begins on page 36. He is very thorough. Julian looked at the folder, then at her, then at the folder. I'll let you read through it, Tabia said, and stood and smoothed her skirt. Take your time. She walked out of that office and into the corridor, and she did not allow herself to feel anything until she was in the elevator with the doors closed. Then, for exactly 4 seconds, she pressed her back against the wall and closed her eyes. 4 seconds. Then she straightened, opened her eyes, and took out her phone to call her attorney. She had 3 weeks left. She intended to use every hour of them. It was the folder that broke something open in Myung-gil. Not Julian. Julian was already structurally compromised. He simply hadn't been informed yet. It was Myung-gil who sat in the private lounge on the 39th floor, reading the surveillance report of what had happened in Julian Osi's office that afternoon, and felt something shift in his chest that he did not immediately have language for. She knew, he said. For a month, Sunjae confirmed. She let the mistress finish building the entire trap before she neutralized it. 1 meeting. 47 pages. Myung-gil set the report down. He had, at this point, spent 4 weeks watching Tabia Nwosu operate. He had met brilliant women who moved through power structures with precision, who understood leverage and timing. He had met ruthless women who made decisions without flinching, who did not permit sentiment to interfere with outcome. He had never, in his life, met a woman who made brilliance and ruthlessness look like the natural resting state of a human being. Effortless, total. The way water is wet without deciding to be. And she did not want his money. She had returned the card without looking at it. She had laughed at his offer of violence. She had told his surveillance men, without breaking stride, that they could stand down or keep up. He found himself, in the quiet hours of that week, doing something he had not done since he was 19 years old, building an empire from a rented desk in a Busan Port District office, thinking about a single person constantly and understanding that he had not yet found the approach that would work. He told himself it was strategic, that there was business logic in monitoring Julian Osei's situation, that several of his own holdings had adjacency to Osei's corporate structure. He told himself this with the sort practiced conviction of a man who has long experience believing whatever is most useful. And then, on a Thursday morning, he called his financial director. Julian Osei's outstanding commercial debt, he said, in the even tone he used for all directives. All of it. I want it acquired, quietly, through the Luxembourg structure. He doesn't learn who holds it until I decide he should. All of it? His director said. All of it. He ended the call, stood at the window. The Seoul skyline held the cold gray light of a November morning. It would take 6 weeks to consolidate the position. It would give him leverage over a man whose empire was already being quietly dismantled by his own wife, which meant the leverage would, in all probability, never need to be deployed. He knew this. He bought the debt anyway. Sunjai found him there an hour later, still at the window, and understood. From the particular quality of the silence, from the untouched coffee, from the fact that Myung-gil had been standing in the same position for 60 minutes, that this had moved past the territory of strategy. He said nothing. There were, at this point, no words that would have been useful. It happened on a Wednesday evening, underground parking structure beneath their building. Concrete and fluorescent cold. The particular smell of oil and enclosed air that belongs to the spaces where cities hide their infrastructure. Julian had been drinking more, sleeping less. The image-conscious cruelty he usually kept private had started surfacing in public. At dinners, in board meetings, in the specific way he spoke to staff when he believed no one important was watching. His internal controls were failing. Tabia had cataloged this under timeline acceleration required and had done what she always did with information that made her uncomfortable. Filed it, factored it, and continued. 3 weeks left. 3 weeks before the forensic audit landed in her attorney's hands. She had waited 26 months. 3 weeks was nothing. She was walking to her car when Julian stepped out from between two vehicles. He was not drunk. That, in some ways, made it worse. He was deliberate, present. He had his phone in his hand and his jaw set, and his eyes had done the thing they did when the charm had fully receded, and what lived beneath it had no interest in performance. You spoke to the board, he said. I speak to a lot of people. A daze called me. His voice carried the specific strain of a man holding it together with effort. She told me you've been meeting privately with her for 6 months. I have a seat on the advisory board, Tabia said. Adaze is a member. We talk. He stepped toward her. Not far. Just enough to change the geometry of the space, to make it a different kind of space than it had been a moment ago. Stop, he said quietly. Whatever you think you're doing, stop. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, Good night, Julian, and moved to step past him. His hand closed around her wrist. He didn't squeeze. Not yet. But the grip was hard and the intention was clear, and Tabia felt the specific cold clarity that arrives when a thing you have long anticipated finally materializes in front of you. She held his gaze, said nothing, waited. What she did not see was the sound of footsteps, then a shadow. Then 2 of Myung-gil's men arriving from the far end of the parking structure with the quiet efficiency of people who had been considerably closer than she had realized. Julian's hand left her wrist. What followed lasted less than 90 seconds. One of the men spoke to Julian in the low, even register of someone who does not need volume because the consequences carry their own weight. And then Julian's arm was at an angle it was not meant to occupy. He made a sound. Brief. Involuntary. Tabia picked up her bag, walked to her car, and drove home. She called Myung-gil at 11, answered on the second ring. She already knew from that single fact, from the speed of it, the readiness of it, that he had been waiting, that he had known exactly what he had done. That did not make her less angry. It made her more. "You had 3 weeks," she said. Her voice was even, not the pleasant, managed evenness she deployed at dinners and board meetings. This was something different. The evenness of a woman who is holding something at temperature and choosing, deliberately, not to let it ignite. Which Myung-gil understood in the first 2 seconds of hearing it was considerably more dangerous. "I had 3 weeks left," she continued. "He was going to make a move in that parking structure. I was going to document it. I was going to add it to a case file currently sitting on my attorney's desk, waiting for one final piece of forensic evidence. That was the plan. That was the sequence." A silence. "He had his hand on your wrist," Myung-gil said. "I know where his hand was. I was there." "Tabia." "I have spent 26 months," she said. And now there was heat underneath the control, precise and contained as a lit pilot light. Building something that is legally airtight and sequenced in a specific order for specific reasons. I needed him to make the first overt physical move on record. Now he is going to spend 3 weeks in a sling, and his lawyers are going to tell him to exercise extreme caution, and the window I needed is going to close. She paused. One breath. "You cost me time." Silence. "I understand," he said. "I don't need you to understand," she said. "I need you to stay out of my timeline." She ended the call. In his sole office, Myung-gil held the phone for a long moment after the line went dead, then set it on the desk, then stood at the window with the expression of a man who has just been told, with surgical precision, something he already knew about himself, and has been made to look at it directly. Had not done it for strategic reasons. He had not done it because Julian's aggression threatened the timeline. He had done it because Julian had put his hand on her wrist, and something in Myung-gil had moved before the calculation could stop it. That was the part that sat with him through the night, in the dark, with Sunjay on the couch saying nothing because there was nothing to say. He had acted without her permission, on her behalf, because he could not, in that moment, not. He understood, by morning, exactly what that meant. He had spent his entire adult life acquiring things by understanding what they required of him. He was beginning to understand what this required. The question was whether he was capable of it. Whether a man who had never, in 41 years, allowed anyone else's terms to govern him could learn, for the first time, to operate entirely on someone else's. The final document arrived on a Friday morning, 112 pages, delivered to her attorney's office at 9, complete, thorough, the product of 14 months of patient cultivation and 3 board members who had chosen, in the end, to trust the right person. The forensic audit documented everything: the offshore routing, the falsified quarterly reports, the shell company disbursements, the coordinated architecture built across 4 years of operation, designed to conceal $43 million. Tabia sat in the conference room and read every page. On page 89, she stopped. She read the section twice, then a third time. Then she set the document down on the table with the careful deliberateness of someone placing something fragile on a surface they are not entirely sure will hold it. The section documented the company's current shareholder structure. Specifically, it noted a change registered quietly through a private trust instrument approximately 6 weeks prior. A block of shares, sufficient to constitute a majority position, had been transferred from a Korean holding company into a private trust registered in her name. She had not done this. She had not known about this. She sat with it for 60 seconds, felt the shape of the emotion it produced. Something with multiple edges. Not quite anger, not quite something warmer, occupying the precise uncomfortable territory between having needed to do this entirely alone and understanding that it had already been done. She did not call Myung-gil. She called her attorney. "The shares in Section 4, she said. "Full transfer history. And I need it confirmed that my ownership is clean. No encumbrances, no conditions, nothing attached to the transfer." 40 minutes. "It's clean," her attorney said. "Unconditional. No reversions, no performance requirements, no conditions of any kind. They're yours." Tabia looked out the window at the gray Friday morning. "All right," she said. "Then let's talk about next Saturday." She closed her folder, sat for a moment longer, thought about a man who had transferred majority shares in her husband's company into her private trust, unconditionally, without telling her, without attaching a single string, and then said nothing and waited. Thought about what kind of man does that? Thought about what it means when a man who has spent his life acquiring things finally encounters something he understands cannot be acquired, and responds not by trying harder, but by simply giving. She picked up her phone, didn't dial, put it back down. There would be time for that. After. The ballroom of the Echo Hotel held 400 people on a Saturday evening. The city's financial and social architecture, assembled in formal wear, moving through the warm air of an event that had been billed as an anniversary celebration and would be discussed in this city for years. Tall centerpieces, white tablecloths, the particular ambient sound of a room full of people who have known each other for decades, performing the social rituals of people who are glad to see each other. Tabia moved through it in emerald silk and a white blazer, her hair loose, a gold watch on her wrist that had belonged to her mother. She carried a champagne flute with practiced ease and no intention of drinking it. She greeted people by name, children's names, recent travels, the details that told people they were remembered, and she smiled, and she laughed, and she deployed every skill she had refined across 26 months of this precise performance. She had, in her clutch, a flash drive. She had, through a contact in the hotel's AV department, who had been well compensated and had asked no unnecessary questions, access to the ballroom's projection system. She had been in position since 8:15. Julian took the microphone at 9:15. The room was full. The champagne had been flowing for 90 minutes. He began with gratitude, thanking the board, the team, the investors. He was good at this. He had always been good at this. The warmth of the room, the expensive occasion, the way 400 people were oriented toward him. He expanded into it, the way he always did, filling the space he believed was naturally his. He was 3 sentences in when Tabia set down her glass, crossed the room, stepped up onto the low stage, and touched his arm. "Darling," she said. The warm smile of a woman making a spontaneous, affectionate gesture at her husband's celebration. "Do you mind? I'd like to say a few words." The room found this charming. Julian found it impossible to refuse in front of 400 witnesses. He smiled, the broad, magnanimous smile of a man sharing his platform, and handed her the microphone. She turned to face the room. She did not look nervous. She did not look angry. She looked like a woman who had been walking toward a specific point for 2 years and had just arrived at it and found it exactly where she expected. "Thank you all for being here," she said. "I want to share something with you tonight because this room deserves to know the full picture of what this company is and what it is about to become." She looked toward the AV booth. The ballroom screens came on. What followed lasted 11 minutes. The forensic summary. The offshore architecture in clean, impossible to misread diagrams. The falsified quarterly reports, displayed side by side with the actual figures. The shell company disbursements. Nadia's name in the wire instructions. The sound in the room changed with every new slide. The way weather changes, incrementally and then all at once, moving from confusion through comprehension into the specific charged silence of 400 people understanding, simultaneously, that they are present at something that will be retold for years. Julian stood beside her for 40 seconds. Then he reached for the microphone. She moved it, smoothly, without looking at him. The board resolution, formalizing the ownership transfer, is on the final slide, she said to the room, with the calm of a woman concluding a presentation she has given many times before. As of this morning, I hold majority shares. The company's legal counsel has been notified. The relevant authorities received documentation 2 hours ago. She lowered the microphone. Julian's security moved toward the stage. 2 men. They made it 4 steps. Myung-gil's men came out of the edges of the room. Not quickly, not dramatically. The way a tide comes in, quietly, from multiple directions, until the ground simply isn't dry anymore. They position themselves with the particular stillness of people for whom this is not an escalation, but a baseline. Julian's security personnel stopped moving, reassessed, remained where they were. The room understood in that moment that there had been a second architecture to this evening, a parallel structure that most of them had been entirely unaware of, that the event they had believed they were attending had been, simultaneously, something else. Myung-gil was at the back of the room. He had not moved from where he'd stood since the lights dimmed. He walked forward now, through the crowd, which parted without being asked, the way crowds part for men who carry that specific frequency of authority. He reached the stage, stepped up, turned to face 400 people. He did not look at Julian, he looked at Tabia. And in front of Lagos's entire financial and social elite, in front of the city's investors and board members and institutional memory, Kim Myung-gil inclined his head. Not a full bow. A precise, deliberate degree of inclination that communicated to anyone watching with any sophistication at all. I see exactly who is standing here. I see precisely what she has done. And I am telling this room, without ambiguity, where the authority in this space actually lives. Julian, in the way of a man whose capacity for self-preservation had been fully eclipsed by his incapacity for defeat, made his final error. He crossed the 3 feet of stage between them and grabbed Tabia's arm. Myung-gil moved. He didn't raise his voice. The room was silent enough that when he spoke, every person in it heard him clearly, without effort. "Take your hand off her," he said. And then, in the particular quiet that followed, he looked at Julian Osi with the precise, unhurried attention of a man who is not angry but is making a permanent decision. And then, look at this room, at the people in it, and understand that you are currently standing in front of your new boss. Julian looked at him, then at Tabia. Something crossed his face in that moment. Not anger, not defiance, something underneath both of those. The expression of a man who has just, for the first time, understood. Not the charges, not the shareholders, not the forensic audit on the ballroom screens. Understood what had actually been happening from the beginning. How long it had been happening. How completely, how precisely, how patiently it had been constructed. And understood, with a clarity that arrived too late to be of any use to him, that he had never once been in control of any of it. He let go. 2 of Myung-gil's men walked him off the stage. The room watched him go. Nobody moved for a long moment. Then, from somewhere in the middle of the room, someone began to applaud. Then someone else. Then the room. All 400 of them, because some moments have a gravity that people recognize, even before they have the language for it. The gravity of watching someone arrive, completely, at what they were always supposed to be. She took over officially on a Monday. The board meeting ran 3 hours, 2 hours and 40 minutes longer than it needed to, because several members who had spent years performing loyalty to Julian were now performing loyalty to Tabia with the committed enthusiasm of people who understand which way the wind has permanently shifted. She let them finish. She thanked them by name. She distributed the restructuring memo and asked for questions. There were no meaningful questions. She signed the final transfer documents at noon in her new office on the 38th floor. Her attorney sat across from her, a cup of tea at her elbow. She drank it this time. After her attorney left, after her assistant closed the door, She stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked at the Atlantic. It was doing what it always did, existing at its particular scale, indifferent to the human dramas unfolding at its edge. She had thought she might feel something enormous when this moment arrived, the high of completion, the specific release of a thing that had been held in tension for a very long time. What she felt instead was quieter, a settling, like a structure that has been under active construction for 2 years and has finally, on this Monday afternoon, gone. Still. She was standing there when her assistant knocked. "There's a Mr. Kim asking if you have a moment." Tabia looked at the water for one more second. "Send him in." He came in the way he always moved through spaces, without performance, without announcement. Dark suit, hands in his pockets. He stopped a few feet inside the door and looked at the office, at the signed documents on the desk, at the Atlantic through the glass, at her, standing in the afternoon light having just taken possession of the thing she had spent 2 years building toward. "Congratulations," he said, without qualification, in the way of a man who has watched something extraordinary and has no interest in diminishing it by attaching anything to the word. "Thank you," she said. A silence. Comfortable, in the way of two people who have been circling each other long enough that the distance between them has become familiar. "The shares," she said. "Were yours," he said. "They were always going to be yours. The paperwork simply confirmed it ahead of schedule." She looked at him for a moment. "You could have told me. You would have refused them." She considered this. "Yes," she said. "I would have." The almost smile, the one she had catalogued across months of unwanted, unavoidable observation. "I know," he said. Then, after a beat, "I've come to ask you something, not to offer you anything. Not to propose terms or a partnership or anything with conditions attached." He held her gaze steadily. "I'd like to take you to dinner, at a restaurant of your choosing, on a day of your choosing, with no agenda except that I find you." A pause, the careful selection of the right word. "Extraordinary. And I would like to tell you so in a context that doesn't involve a parking structure or 400 witnesses." Tabia looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the Atlantic held the late afternoon light. "I'm free Thursday," she said. 7 o'clock. I'll choose the restaurant." The corner of his mouth moved. "Of course you will." "And Myeong-gil," she said as he turned toward the door. He looked back. "Next time you decide to act on my behalf," she said, with the unhurried authority of a woman standing at a window she now owns, looking at a sea that has always known her name, "you ask me first." He held her gaze, then inclined his head. That same precise degree of inclination from the ballroom, offered now without an audience, in a room with no witnesses. Which made it mean, she understood, considerably more. "Understood," he said. And then he left, quietly, the way he always came and went. Without announcement, without performance, and with the particular quality of a man who has, for the first time in his life, found something worth adjusting himself for. The door closed. Tabia turned back to the window, to the Atlantic, to the empire that was now, legally and completely and without condition, hers. She had spent 2 years wearing a mask. She had spent 6 months being watched. She had spent 26 months building something in the dark that she had always known would one day stand in the light. She had not needed saving. She had not needed a shield or a sword or a black titanium card with no limit. She had needed time and patience and the absolute unshakable knowledge that the woman she was, behind the smile, beneath the silk, underneath every performance she had ever given in that dining room, was always going to be enough. She picked up her tea. It was still warm.